So I'm considering just maybe planting a garden this spring. Now, anyone who has ever been in my office and seen the very, very sad plant that lives there knows that I'm actually really good at killing plants. It is not a natural gift for me, unlike my papa, who had a beautiful vegetable garden and lovely, if not finicky, roses. And I know that many of you have lovely gardens as well. I've enjoyed the tomatoes, green beans, peppers, and others from your hard work. And from my limited reading of The Idiot's Guide to Gardening, which I really do own, it just keeps telling me there's no way around it. Gardening is hard work. Which makes it even stranger for me that the word paradise originally referred to a garden. Because typically when I think about paradise, it doesn't involve hard work, let alone pulling weeds. When I think about paradise, I think that things are easy, things are pleasant and lovely, at least for me. But then maybe my idea about paradise isn't quite right. Which makes it all the more interesting the ways that it's used in our passage that we're reading today from the Gospel of Luke as we work our way through the 7 last words. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders, starting later. I'm going to start. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So once again, like last week's word from the cross, which was, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do," Jesus does not answer necessarily the way that we would, or at least that I would. He doesn't offer anger, he doesn't offer his own pain, but instead a promise to a stranger. And after some study, I realized why this use of the word paradise felt so strange to me when I read it. It's the only time it's mentioned in the Gospels. It's actually only used 3 times throughout the New Testament. And sometimes that's a little clue, like that's a sign that if the author uses this particular word and it's unfamiliar, we should probably pay attention to it. And again, when I researched it some more, I found out that the original translation of the word paradise is garden or park. But when a first century Jew would have heard this word, they would have thought of the most important garden they know and that we know, which is Eden. It was only later that the word paradise took on the idea of a place after death. And then when it took on that idea, it was ultimately the restoration of the first garden, the restoration of Eden. That's how the earliest readers would have heard this phrase. So why would Jesus or the author of Luke use this word, and why would it be associated at the crucifixion? Well, I think it's tied to another word that Jesus uses, and that's today. He says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That this is not about necessarily a faraway future, which I thought seems obvious because they are going to die that day. But I think it's something more for those of us who are hearing it later, the first readers of this gospel and those of us hearing it now, that Jesus was talking about that the restoration of the garden is immediate, that it's in the present, and that in order for that garden to be restored, some radical changes were going to have to happen. And Jesus was familiar with this garden because he had read the scriptures, and because ultimately he had spent his ministry planting seeds for the garden of God. That Jesus' whole life and his whole ministry was to show and reveal that if we start really living within the boundaries and guidelines God had laid out for us so long ago, that we could be in paradise, that we could be in that garden again today. That God had already given those ways to the Jewish people through the laws and the covenant, and now Jesus was revealing it and teaching it to everyone how to restore that garden. It's not that we can go back and uneat that fruit and undo what had happened, but we could live by God's ways and reveal paradise. That Jesus has given us those seeds already. Every part of his ministry was planting the seeds for that garden. And that throughout the scriptures and the history, God has been planting those seeds through the mothers and fathers of our faith. And then Jesus now invites us to do it too. Now, most of us are familiar with, the pretty seeds, the ones that we like a lot, like the fruits of the Spirit, compassion and self-control and gentleness and kindness, goodness, peace, love, and joy. We're familiar with the parables and the miracles, that those seeds are planted deeply in our faith, the ones that remind us of God's protection and God's power. And you can find those seeds throughout the Gospels when you read them. In the miracles, he taught about God's abundance in comparison to our own limited abundance, like when he turned water into wine and 2 loaves of bread and some fish to feed thousands. The miraculous things that happen when following God. He taught us not to fear because we are under divine protection when he calmed the seas and he walked on water. He showed us through those parables and stories that God searches in extravagant ways for the lost and the lonely and the forgotten, and that with God's help we can do it too. Jesus taught us, planted the seeds to give away the things that keep us from fully following God, whether that's wealth or the false perceptions that we need our stuff to be valuable ourselves. He taught us to love everyone equally, and that should be reflected in how we treat everyone else on the planet. He said to live by the spirit of God's law whenever it bent towards mercy and love. Because God's ways, these laws, are the seeds that plant gardens that give life, that plant gardens that resemble Eden. And who doesn't want to live in that garden? In paradise. Those were not the only seeds that Jesus planted. And those weren't the seeds that got him in trouble. Because if we get past the pretty parts of the garden, we can see there are other sections. They're a little harder to get to. We may have to leave quite a bit behind in order to enter. And in this section, there are thorns. So we might get hurt. These seeds can make us uncomfortable or even angry. They do for me. But when I really thought about it, they should make me as uncomfortable as looking at the crucifixion does, or should. Because the garden that Jesus was planting was also meant to disrupt the whole world. It was meant to turn all the systems of power upside down. In this garden, the government can't treat people as if certain citizens are less valuable, less worthy of protection, and don't deserve better lives by cutting services and regularly punishing them. Jesus said to the religious leaders at the time, you can't keep preaching a prosperity message where the prosperity is only for you and not for the rest of the garden or the kingdom. And he said, every time you try to exclude people or convince them that they don't get to have God's love or your love because they're blind or are refugees or adulterers or women or Samaritans or Gentiles or Muslims or Palestinians, or they're from Ferguson, Missouri, or they're drug addicts from Jeffersonville. Somehow you have not let the stories of God's inclusive and abundant love take root in you fully. He also says it happens when we stay silent in the face of injustices, when we close our doors and windows and simply say, "Thank you, it's not me," that we let fear win over justice. That's the kind of stuff that got him on the cross. If we're not either deeply uncomfortable or righteously angry by many of the seeds he's planting, it may mean I'm not paying attention the right way. And clearly his words are not just for those in the first century. They have followed us here. Those seeds made many of the powerful angry, and more importantly, it made them scared. First, they just tried to ignore him. Then they tried to frighten him by killing John the Baptist. They tried to shut him up in the courts and in front of Pilate. But those seeds that he had planted had roots in the kingdom of God. It had roots in the people who had followed him. It had grown, this garden had started to grow, and it could not be stopped. And those seeds grew roots in the hearts of many who heard him, and they came out in the thousands. And a movement that would change the world was just beginning as his life was ending. Because he told the powerful and the comfortable not just the hard lessons, but he also handed them the gift of this garden, of a new way of seeing the world through God's eyes and vision for creation. He said, "You will not do this of your own power, but by God's power." And he planted seeds in the hearts of people like Nicodemus, a religious leader, in Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, and the women who left their comfortable homes to follow Jesus and used their resources to support his ministry. And Jesus told them, your power and your resources and your money can build God's garden. It can build a garden that chokes out injustice, one that cultivates the fruits of the Spirit of compassion and gentleness, forgiveness and kindness. He told fishermen and tax collectors, children and youth and women, you have the ability to plant seeds just like anyone else. That the good news of God's garden is yours for the sharing. Your voices are welcome, and they are as powerful as everyone else's. He said, every voice can bring justice. Jesus spoke of this paradise, this garden on the cross, because the seeds he was planting are worth dying for. They are worth living dramatically different lives so that others can simply have enough. It's because the garden and the gospel can't wait. Because even in the very first story of creation, humanity was placed in the garden to take care of it, to tend it lovingly. And that is still the call of the gospel, to care for God's creation, to care for all of God's creatures. And just like any garden, it'll be hard work. But we need all the help we can get, and no one gets out of this kind of work. And when you have the seeds for God's kingdom, God's garden, given to you by Jesus Christ himself, saying, I will be with you, how can we not start planting?